Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. So we are going to be continuing our discussion about Dead Like Me. We are going to be talking about Season 2, Episode 2. This episode is called The Ledger. Now what's interesting about this episode to me is that the timing of this is a little suspicious because we learned in the vacation episode that Rube gets a little bit more than what he lets on. He doesn't just get the name and the date and the time of a death. He also gets like a last thought and some other information that the Reapers don't find out in their post-it. So in this episode, George confronts Rube at his apartment and is like, yo, what else do you get? Because there's things that you knew about me and I was just a little girl and you wrote down my name and what else did you know about me? And it reveals later that Rube only gets a little bit of information, but it basically boils down to the exact conversation that happened when George was outside of her parents' house just crying right before the milkman died. Is that, regardless of if you know who's gonna die or how they're gonna die or any information about them, you can't do anything about it because death is scheduled. It's gonna come for you no matter what, and you can't change it. And Rube basically tells her, I didn't know what a good kid you were gonna be, but even if I had, I still would have written your name down because you were supposed to die and there's not anything I can do about that. So it's kind of a rough moment for George, and this starts a lot of this bad luck spiral. This whole episode is focused on the idea of luck and the scales balancing each other out. And George in this episode is very, very unlucky. Her bike gets stolen and that sucks. When she gets to Happy Time, she finds out that there's been a bunch of theft that's happening, and this LP guy is there doing this presentation about theft and basically accuses George in front of everybody. And then everyone in Happy Time thinks that Millie is a thief. There are a few clunky metaphors. Mason tries his hand at the shell game and is very, very bad at it. There's a point where when George goes to report that her bike was stolen, the police officers are playing scratchers in the back and they mention that they didn't win anything and how bad luck it was. So just the entire episode is really focused on this idea of luck, and some metaphors are a little more clunky, but we'll move on to the B cast. So we have Clancy and Joy. They're kind of finalizing some of this divorce process. They're separating their items based off of who brought what into the marriage and houses for sale. And that is what's driving their plot this episode, is as they kind of go through and start talking about the things that they brought into the marriage and, talking about some of the good times and some of the hard times. And it's very clear that Reggie does not like Clancy right now and she's really mad at him. We don't know if that's because of Joy's influence or just because Reggie's a smart kid and she can probably read through her dad's motivations and what he's done to cause this divorce. So George finds out about this transaction, that the house is being sold, but she doesn't quite know why. And so this really is just bringing her down into the dumps. So by the time she gets to Happy Time, she gets accused by this loss prevention guy that she's stolen stuff. And on that topic, this episode has a huge misdirection because in the beginning, George talks about how she's obsessed with Post-its, and it shows someone breaking into a Happy Time cabinet and taking a bunch of Post-its. And we find out at the very end of the episode that it was Crystal who's been stealing Post-it notes. We don't know why Crystal's been stealing them, but Crystal's been stealing a butt ton of Post-it notes. She's got a mountain in her closet. So anyway, George leaves Happy Time to go to a meeting when in fact she actually has to go to her Reap, and she ends up getting her fancy coat completely ruined with this huge blood stain in one of the most, I think, gruesome deaths on the show, where there's this fruit guillotine called the kitchen guillotine, and you put your fruit on this blade, this single blade, and you crush it like a guillotine. And the mall guy who's selling these, he gets pushed down and gets killed on this guillotine, and it's pretty gruesome, it's pretty disgusting, but the scales balance out for George, and she takes his car keys, basically is like, I deserve this, I needed this, and she takes her new car, she drives to the last house and schedules a walkthrough with the realtor, and she finds out that her parents are getting divorced. And wow, this was hard for George because she had no idea. She had no idea that any of this was happening. She had no idea about the problems that have arisen, because yes, she's been spying on her family, she's been checking in on them, but she's not seeing the problems that are happening between Joy and Clancy. To her, this is just how her parents interact with each other, but they're very quiet when people are around. When Reggie is around, they don't talk about their problems. They tiptoe around them. There's only been a few times where they've really just lost control, but for the most part, they're pretty quiet about it. So even if George was watching them all the time, she wouldn't necessarily catch those moments, because they usually have those conversations when they're on their own about how much they dislike each other. So this crushes Georgia, and she eventually talks to Rube about it, about how everything is falling apart at home, and she's got very little control, and she took this car because she needed it. It was the world's way of balancing out the scales and giving her a little bit of luck. And Rube, says sometimes a death of a child isn't what caused the divorce, it gives it a long due burial. And this is so true for Clancy and Joy, so true for them. So the last thing that I want to point out about this episode is that on top of everything that's happening, this seems to be months and months later, because Roxy is already a cop. She's already, doing things where she can file paperwork. And in the last episode that we saw, Roxy had just joined the police academy, and that takes some time. It's not like you can just join the police academy and then you're a cop doing, field work the next day. So this has to be months later. And so the fact that George is now dwelling on this, well, what other information did you have about me all of this time later, is interesting. And that may be just a writer flaw, or maybe this was a plot from an old episode that they wanted to use but just never got to. I think overall there are some minor details that could have been finessed about this episode, but I think what it did a really great job at doing is explaining Georgia's sadness and kind of walking through this, like, all of these bad things have happened to her, and now some good things need to start happening, and whether she needs to manifest that herself or if the world's gonna do it for her, it's gonna happen. And I think George is realizing, like, as a Grim Reaper, she's kind of got to just make things happen. Nobody's gonna ever do anything for her. No one's gonna take care of her if she's not taking care of herself first. And I think that's important for her. So my favorite quote from this episode is from Reggie. There is a point where she and Joy are talking about leaving the house and selling it, and she is like, well, Mom, you should go and get a job. And Joy says, don't you remember how incredibly unhappy I was when I was working? And Reggie says, you're always incredibly unhappy. And that resonates with me. I feel that line strongly and deeply and emotionally. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.